The crowd was laughing until her 10th shot shattered the final target dead center, and silence fell like a dropped curtain. A billionaire rose to his feet, stunned, whispering, "Run that back in slow motion." Who was this quiet woman with the rusty rifle? But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The gravel beneath her boots crunched with a steady rhythm as Patricia, Patty, Walker walked the long, sun-drenched path toward the shooting line. The late summer sky hung wide and cloudless over the sprawling Idaho hills. But inside the boundaries of the Rocky Ridge Shooting Club, the temperature ran cooler, socially at least. It wasn't the kind of place where someone like Patty was meant to belong. The entrance gate alone had more polish than anything she owned. Wrought iron filigree framed with burnished oak, engraved with gold-plated letters spelling Rocky Ridge Elite Marksman Society. Inside, the clubhouse looked more like a resort spa than a hunting lodge. Leather armchairs, imported cigars, and iced champagne were as common as clay targets. The members weren't hunters. They were hobbyists of privilege, billionaires in camo-printed designer shirts pretending to touch the wilderness for sport. Patty's presence felt like a stain on the linen. Her denim overalls sagged at the knees. The faded army green ball cap sat askew above her graying braid, and her boots bore the evidence of actual work. Dried mud, cracked leather, sun-bleached edges. Her rifle was even worse. A well-loved, beat-up Ruger 1022 that looked like it had more years on it than the men currently sipping mimosas on the observation deck. She didn't flinch when the security guard took an extra few seconds inspecting her ID, as if expecting it to dissolve into sawdust in his hand. Nor did she react when the receptionist asked twice, if she was sure she was in the right place. Patty simply smiled with the same patience she'd reserved for church bake sales, funerals, and dog shelter visits. She had no desire to impress anyone. She had come to shoot. That was it. Inside the spectator area, murmurs rolled like distant thunder. A low hum of amusement brewed among the VIP attendees as she crossed the manicured lawn toward the event registration tent. All eyes were drawn to her the way people can't help watching a train car teeter off the rails. Several of the guests leaned over to get a better view, their designer sunglasses hiding eyes dripping with condescension. "She's not seriously entering, is she?" whispered a woman in a white polo shirt and diamonds the size of blueberries. "I give her 3 shots before the rifle jumps out of her hands," Derek Duke Kessler sneered, his voice loud enough for her to hear as he adjusted his $8,000 Italian leather shooting gloves. Patty looked his way briefly, offering nothing but the gentlest of nods. He didn't know what to do with that, but it was Chase Breckenridge III who delivered the day's first kill shot, though not with a firearm. He stepped out from the crowd like a show pony, tan and smug, heir to more money than ideas. Grinning wide for his phone's camera crew, he gestured at Patty and stage whispered, "What's she gonna do? Bake us a pie after?" Laughter exploded like gunfire. Even the staff, trained to remain neutral, chuckled under their breath. The moment swelled with humiliating glee, and Patty was the bullseye. She didn't blink. She walked up to the range official and handed over her registration. Patricia Walker, public entry, paid in full. The man behind the table hesitated, perhaps unsure whether to confirm her presence or call for management. Eventually, he nodded and handed her a numbered badge. "You'll be up in Heat 7. Patty walked to the staging area, took a seat on the cold metal bench, and laid her rifle gently across her knees. Her fingers traced the worn wood grain, each scratch a memory. She didn't look around. She didn't fidget. She sat as still as a hawk watching the field, ignoring the murmurs still buzzing around her like mosquitoes. The other contestants in her heat arrived one by one, each dressed like they'd stepped off a fashion shoot for Field and Stream. Billionaire edition. There were gold-plated scopes, custom holsters, and rifles so new they still smelled like a showroom. One man's initials were engraved into the barrel of his custom Beretta. None of them spoke to her. Not really. One nodded. Another offered a fake half-smile that never reached his eyes. She was invisible again. Or worse, a sideshow act to be observed and dismissed. All right, contestants for Heat 7, step to the line, the announcer boomed over the PA. You'll each have 10 clay targets. Best accuracy wins bragging rights. And maybe some press coverage. Patty stood. The laughter had died down, but the eyes were still there, watching, ready, expectant in the worst way. A few cameras tilted toward her, not out of respect, out of curiosity. People loved to film car wrecks. She moved to her assigned spot, second from the end. Chase and Duke were on the far left, talking under their breath like high school bullies warming up for a prank. The announcer gave the signal. She raised her rifle. Not fast, not slow. Smooth. And in that brief moment, before the first clay was launched, she adjusted her glasses with one finger, squared her shoulders, and exhaled, not to calm herself, but to steady the storm. Because Patty Walker wasn't a joke. She was just a ghost. And no one sees the ghost until it's already taken the shot. The crack of each shot echoed across the range like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. There was no pause, no hesitation in Patty's rhythm. Each movement, from raising the rifle to sighting down the barrel to squeezing the trigger, was done with a calm precision that didn't just suggest skill, but ownership. This wasn't performance. It was instinct. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was simply remembering who she had always been. Behind the desk, Allie gripped the clipboard tighter than necessary, her knuckles pale against the polished mahogany. The transformation she had just witnessed left her breathless. Not just because of Patty's marksmanship, but because of what it revealed. The ridicule, the arrogance, the sneering entitlement that had filled the air minutes ago now seemed absurd in the presence of someone so quietly, devastatingly capable. When Allie had first seen Patty walk in, she'd assumed, like everyone else, that the woman was out of place. Maybe a well-meaning grandmother who'd misread the event flyer. But as the shooting began, and those calm, relentless shots rang out, Allie's assumptions dissolved like smoke. The way Patty handled that battered rifle wasn't the fumbling of a hobbyist. It was muscle memory, deeply embedded from years of repetition, stress, and high stakes. She wasn't a lost old woman. She was a weapon that had been stored quietly away, until now. Patty lowered her rifle with the same calmness she'd displayed throughout. Her breathing never changed. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply stepped back from the line and returned to her bench, gently placing the rifle across her lap as though tucking in an old friend. It was the silence afterward that struck everyone the most. Not one of the VIPs dared to speak immediately. The earlier chorus of sarcastic laughter was gone, replaced by an awkward vacuum of confusion, awe, and just barely shame. Even Chase and Derek looked unsure of themselves. Chase tugged at the collar of his high-end sportswear, eyes darting to the others as if waiting for someone to break the tension with a joke. Derek fidgeted with his sunglasses, wiping non-existent smudges while avoiding eye contact with anyone. But no one moved. The range felt like a church. Allie was the first to exhale. She stepped away from the check-in desk and approached Patty, her steps tentative, almost reverent. The clipboard trembled slightly in her hands. "That was," she began, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat, tried again. "That was incredible." Patty looked up. There was no spark of pride in her eyes, just a quiet warmth. "Thank you, honey," she said, the same way she might have responded to a compliment about a pie crust. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Allie asked, even though the question seemed too small now, too obvious. Patty tilted her head slightly. "Long time ago, in another life." Allie sat beside her without asking, the clipboard now forgotten in her lap. "You're not just good. You're scary good," Patty chuckled. "Scared a few folks in my time, that's for sure." The casual way she said it made Allie blink. "Military?" "Army," Patty replied simply. "Sharpshooter instructor for nearly 2 decades. Allie's jaw loosened. "That explains everything." Patty looked toward the horizon, where the sunlight had begun to soften into afternoon gold. "It explains enough." There was a long pause between them. Not the awkward kind, just the quiet understanding that comes when something is finally seen for what it is. In that stillness, Allie realized how much this moment mattered. Not just for Patty, but for herself. For every woman who had ever been talked over, laughed at, or brushed aside. Patty wasn't just another contestant. She was a living contradiction to every smug, shallow assumption that had built the social walls of the Rocky Ridge Club. "I'm sorry for the way they treated you," Allie said suddenly, her voice low, thick with something rawer than guilt. Patty turned to her with a softness that made Allie want to cry. "Sugar," she said gently, "people only know what they've been shown. I don't take it personally. But you should have been treated with respect." Patty smiled, but there was a quiet, aching weight behind it. "Respect has never been handed to me. I've always had to earn it. And sometimes, when you do, it still doesn't come from the people you expect." The words sank deep. Allie felt them settle in her ribs like heat, slow and heavy. "Why didn't you tell them who you were?" she asked after a while. Patty's smile lingered. "Because they already decided who I wasn't." Behind them, the announcer cleared his throat into the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice noticeably more measured now, "we'll be taking a brief intermission before the next round. In the meantime, please join us in recognizing the remarkable shooting displayed by contestant Patricia Walker." A few scattered claps followed, hesitant, embarrassed. Then more joined, then more. The sound grew, not quite thunderous, but honest. No one cheered. That would have felt cheap. But they clapped, and not because they were told to, because they didn't know what else to do with the truth that had just rearranged the air around them. Patty nodded once, a modest gesture of acknowledgement. She stood, brushed invisible dust from her pants, and slung the rifle over her shoulder. "Let me know if you need help organizing the next group," she told Allie, as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The sun had shifted by mere degrees, yet the entire atmosphere of the shooting range felt transformed, like the earth itself had tilted slightly under the weight of revelation. The laughter that once bounced off the walls of the Rocky Ridge Shooting Club was gone, replaced by something heavier, quieter, and far more difficult for most of the men there to name: humility. It hung in the air as Forrest Langston, broad-shouldered and stone-faced, lowered his Stetson and looked into Patty Walker's eyes like a soldier seeing a long-lost comrade. He wasn't a man who handed out praise lightly. Oil built his empire, but combat had forged his values, and those values weren't impressed by money, charm, or pedigree. He didn't care what label your jeans carried or how shiny your gear was, only what you could do when it mattered. And what he'd just seen didn't just matter. It redefined the standard. "I've seen Delta snipers miss one or two in the wind," Forrest said, his voice gravel thick, addressing no one and everyone at once. She didn't blink. Patty said nothing. She didn't need to. Her presence alone now carried a gravity no one could deny. Not even Derek or Chase, who still stood slack-jawed near the scoreboard, their inflated personas shriveled under the harsh sun of raw competence. A minute ago, they had been kings. Now, they were spectators to something they hadn't trained for, respect earned without pretense, without flash, without apology. A low murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Phones tilted upward. Social media accounts long used for flaunting guns and yachts now tried to capture a different currency: authentic excellence. Hashtags formed mid-air. Granny Sharpshooter, Kruntan, out of 10, Rocky Ridge legend. One man in a blazer whispered, "That's the same rifle my grandfather used to plink cans behind the barn. She just rewrote the rule book." But Patty didn't revel in it. There was no swelling pride, no triumphant pose. She just stood there, arms crossed lightly, like someone waiting for the grocery line to move. If anything, the attention seemed slightly uncomfortable to her, like a coat too tight at the shoulders. Still, admiration kept pouring in. A boy, no more than 14, and wearing a lanyard marked "Guest," broke from his father's side and rushed forward. His sneakers scuffed against the gravel as he clutched a battered shooting pamphlet in one hand. "Excuse me, ma'am," he asked, voice shaking. "Can I get your autograph?" Patty blinked at him. "Autograph?" she repeated, gently surprised. The boy nodded, eyes wide. "I've never seen anyone shoot like that. Ever. Not even on YouTube." There was a pause. Then a smile slowly curved across Patty's face, and she took the pen he offered. She signed the pamphlet in neat, looping cursive. "P. Walker. Keep your eye steady." The boy ran off beaming like he'd just met Annie Oakley herself. That was when the real shift happened, not in the crowd, but in the eyes of those who'd laughed earlier. One by one, they began walking toward Patty, not out of obligation, but reverence. A quiet line formed. Men who were used to commanding attention now waited to shake the hand of the woman they'd mocked minutes ago. Chase Breckenridge approached last. He looked smaller now, not physically, but in presence. His usual swagger had dissolved, replaced by the awkward gait of someone unsure where they stood in a room that had redefined the rules. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he began, eyes darting to the side. That was, look, I shouldn't have." Patty held up a hand. Don't worry, she said, not cruelly, but firmly. You already said plenty. Chase swallowed hard. Then, without another word, he nodded and backed away, a rare lesson carved into his pride. Forrest Langston stepped back into view, turning toward the gathering of spectators. Let this be a reminder, he said, his voice carrying the command of someone who had addressed troops and tycoons alike. The loudest one in the room usually has the least to say, and the one you least expect is often the one you ought to listen to. Someone started clapping, then another, and then it spread, not forced, not polite, but genuine. The sound rose like a wave, not just for Patty's skill, but for what she represented, for the reality she had unveiled. That greatness wears no uniform, no label, and doesn't need an introduction. Allie stood off to the side, hands trembling slightly at her sides. A single tear had made its way down her cheek, but she didn't bother brushing it away. It wasn't sadness. It was something deeper. She'd seen something true today, unfiltered, unscripted, and impossibly rare. Patty had walked into a kingdom of gold and glass with nothing but a rusty rifle and an old soul, and she hadn't just stood her ground. She had reminded everyone what real strength looked like. "You okay?" someone whispered beside her. Allie nodded, smiling faintly. I needed to see this." Across the lawn, Patty began walking away from the line, her rifle slung casually over her shoulder. The wind picked up just enough to lift the hem of her shirt, revealing a faded tattoo on her forearm. Barely legible, but clear enough to those who knew. RLTW. Rangers lead the way. Another layer of truth, quietly revealed. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. Respect followed her. The morning light filtered softly through the thin lace curtains of Patty Walker's kitchen, casting pale yellow patterns across the time-worn tile. Outside, the first rustlings of early September stirred the trees, still green, but with the scent of turning seasons in the air. The house sat like it always had, squat and unassuming, nestled at the end of a dirt road that no GPS ever found on the first try. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon and wood polish. A kettle hummed quietly on the stove. The only other sound was the rhythmic thump of Biscuit's tail, tapping the floor as he dozed under the breakfast table. The package arrived in the same way all things arrived to Patty, without fanfare, without urgency. The postal worker left it by the front door alongside her regular mail. Farmers market coupons, a church newsletter, and a water bill folded neatly in a torn envelope. The box wasn't large, but it had weight to it, a thickness not just of contents, but of meaning. Patty picked it up, turned it once in her hands. Her name was handwritten in black ink, Mrs. Patricia Walker. No return address, only the discreet stamp of Langston Industries in the corner. She didn't open it immediately. She took her time, as she did with all things. She brewed her tea, fed Biscuit, wiped the counter twice, even though it didn't need it. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, the one with the scratched varnish and the dented leg she'd been meaning to fix for 8 years, and slid her finger beneath the tape. The letter lay on top, printed on thick stationery. She read it slowly, her lips moving silently with the words, "Dear Mrs. Walker, your skill is extraordinary, but your humility is even rarer. Enclosed is an invitation to be head firearms instructor for our Veterans Rehabilitation Program. We need people like you. Also, your pie recipe, unreal. Respectfully, Forrest Langston. Below it sat a crisp envelope containing the check, $250,000. She didn't reach for it, didn't even lift it from the box. Her eyes lingered on it for a long while, but the expression on her face didn't change. Not joy, not shock, not disbelief, just a quiet stillness, as if, on some level, she had expected this. Not because she felt entitled to it, but because she understood how the world worked when, for once, it decided to work right. Biscuit stirred beside her, sensing the moment in the way dogs often do, and leaned his head against her ankle. She reached down, scratched behind his ear, and whispered, "Well, look at that." For years, she had lived in this house on a modest military pension, and the occasional odd job, teaching church kids how to read maps, fixing broken porch steps for neighbors, baking pies for local contests and community fundraisers. Her life had been lived in the margins. Not because she was afraid of the spotlight, but because the spotlight had always been too busy shining elsewhere. Then, in the span of 10 minutes on a sunny range surrounded by rich men who'd never known hunger, she had flipped the script without raising her voice, without boasting, without breaking stride. The world had noticed, finally. Not because she chased attention, but because she'd done something no one could ignore. And now the world wanted something more from her. She ran her fingers across the edge of the letter again. "Instructor," she murmured. "Lord help them." The invitation wasn't just a job offer, it was a bridge between her past and a future she hadn't dared imagine. It meant stepping back into a world she'd walked away from, the day she folded her husband's funeral flag and placed it on a shelf above her bed. It meant returning to the front lines in a different way, not with a rifle in combat, but with wisdom, patience, and presence. It meant being seen. And yet, Patty didn't cry. She didn't leap up or call anyone. There was no one to call anyway, just a few neighbors, a sister in Kansas who preferred letters to phone calls, and a church friend who still thought Patty had once been a librarian. The people who mattered most, her husband, her squad mates, existed now only in memories and folded photographs. But she wasn't alone. Not really. The rifle leaned against the door, silent and loyal, as it always had been. It had stayed with her, through deployments and discharge papers, dusty garages, and back closets, until yesterday, when it finally returned to doing what it had always done best, speaking for her. Patty stood up, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back in the envelope. She slid the check beneath the doily that sat in the middle of the table. She didn't need to stare at it. Money was nice. Purpose was better. She moved toward the pantry, pulled down a bag of flour, then butter, sugar, cinnamon, and apples. The motion was fluid, practiced, sacred. The kitchen came alive under her hands. The creak of the drawer, the clang of the pie tin, the soft rustle of parchment paper. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like applause. As she rolled out the dough, she hummed an old tune. The kind her husband used to whistle while cleaning his rifle. The kind that reminded her of summers in Georgia, of sun on her back, of things that didn't need to be explained to be understood. Biscuit snored beneath the window, The scent of apples and spice began to drift through the air. Patty glanced at the rifle by the door. Then she smiled and said softly, "Told you I still had it." Some victories don't demand celebration. They just ask for a pie in the oven and peace in the heart.